Welcome to this short lecture on multiple sclerosis. This lecture will cover the pathophysiology, the clinical manifestations, and the risk factors associated with multiple sclerosis. So first, let's get a definition of what this word or these words mean. So sclerosis, you may have heard with atherosclerosis. So sclerosis specifically means plaque. Multiple meaning many. So these plaques are within the central nervous system. So these are within the brain and spinal cord. The area or the tissue that is affected is what we call the myelin. Now going back to A&P, we know that you have a neuron with an axon and it sends electrical information to its N-terminal, which then can synapse onto another neuron or maybe to an effector organ like a muscle or a gland or something like that. Now, the way it sends electrical impulses is via action potential. And what it allows it to do is this myelin, which you can see in blue, now in the central nervous system, this myelination is done by oligodendrocytes, and the action potential is sped up by these myelin. So it can almost like jump between the myelin gaps, and that allows the propagation speed to be much quicker. Now with multiple sclerosis, what is essentially happening? Well, for some reason we have inflammation and we have destruction, which leads to the destruction of these oligodendrocytes and subsequently their myelin. And so the speed of action potential is diminished and slowed and may even stop altogether. Now, depending on where the brain or spinal cord this has been affected will determine whether it's a sensory, a motor, a behavioral or emotional or a cognitive effect or all of them altogether. So this is essentially the premise of what we're working on today. Before we go into the pathophysiology, let's first look at some of the common risk factors or the strong risk factors that are associated with MS. So we'll go across here and we'll type right up risk factors. So in no real order, but these are the most common and the strongest risk factors that are shown in the literature. Firstly, we have gender or sex. So it appears that females are about 3-to-1 to males, and that rate appears to be increasing. Now, when we discuss these risk factors, I'll actually incorporate them a bit later when we do the pathophysiology. So I'll just list them now, and then we'll go and explain how they are a risk later. Another one is latitude. So it appears that as you move away from the equator and go towards the poles, the risk increases, and that is both in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So essentially, as you move away from the equator and move to temperate and then into seasonal areas, the risk of developing MS increases. Another one is smoking. So the literature suggests that smokers have a significant higher risk than non-smokers. Genetics. It also appears that those who have the disease are in the first degree relatives like the parents, siblings, children. The likelihood is about 20 to 40 times more of a risk in that particular group. So we've got genetics and inheritance. And then finally, we do have infections. Now, there are a number of infections that are associated with MS, but the strongest one seems to be Epstein-Barr virus. So EBV. There are other bacteria and viruses, but it seems like Epstein-Barr has the strongest risk. So these are the most common risks that are presented in the literature. Now we will go across to the pathophysiology and start to try and get a head around what leads to MS forming. So what I've drawn here is we've got a generic axon with myelin, and down here I've drawn the blood-brain barrier. Because within the central nervous system, technically, we shouldn't find any immune cells. There are the glia that we know as microglia that kind of work as an immune function in the central nervous system, but all the white blood cells and all the other immune cells that we know outside the body don't exist within the central nervous system. So what needs to happen is the first cell of importance is what we call a T lymphocyte, or I'll just call it a T cell. So the first event seems to be that this gets primed and activated. Now, some of the things that can do this. So the latitude effect seems to be associated with priming or activating the T cell. And the cytokines that may be associated with it may lead to its activation. So the thought behind why the latitude is probably a deficiency in either vitamin D or UV light that seems to put a person possibly in a state to activate T cells. In conjunction with that, we also see that with females have a stronger T cell response in their immune system. And so when a T cell is activated peripherally, it has the capacity to breach the blood-brain barrier. Now, with the blood-brain barrier, it's kind of got three main parts to it. You've got the endothelial cell. So this is the blood vessel within the brain. So you've got endothelial cells, you've got the kind of basement membrane, and then you've got the feet of the astrocytes. So I haven't drawn the astrocytes in. These are just the feet associated with it. Now, for some reason, the T cell, once it's activated, is able to breach through. There's a more complicated explanation for this, but I think that's outside the scope for today. Now, another thing that will possibly put a person at a higher risk is their smoking. Smoking not only predisposes one to more autoimmunity, but also it puts them into a pro-inflammatory state. And this can also lead to the activation of the T cell. Now, the T cell is then able to breach through the blood-brain barrier where it enters into the central nervous system. And it seems to then react to myelin. And with its reaction, it will spill out a whole lot of cytokines. Now, with this pathogenesis, it seems that there's an overlapping process between two things. There's a state of inflammation and a state of degeneration. And probably the inflammation may start slightly ahead, but then they kind of run concurrently. So with the T cell releasing its cytokines as reactant to the myelin, these cytokines can further cause breaching within the blood-brain barrier, but it also has the potential to bring other immune cells along, such as macrophages and B cells. These are then able to come into the central nervous system and further aggravate the whole process. With the degenerative part, the cytokines that are produced seem to also activate what we call microglia. And as I said a bit earlier, they are the kind of immune-like cell within the central nervous system normally. Now, this branch of the effect that's occurring, they seem to have more of an effect on the axons rather than the myelin. So they can cause kind of like oxidative injury and chronic neuroinflammation, which leads to kind of like a Wallerian degeneration or axonal injury. So that's from the microglia side of things. The T cells with the macrophages and B cells seem to specifically target oligodendrocytes and their myelin, which leads to damage and slow destruction of that. Now, this process that we've just gone through seems to be, in many cases, brought on by other things like infections. So this is where maybe the virus can maybe initiate the process, or just general stress or fatigue. But this process, which then results in a symptom, seems to be predisposed by something else, an event that causes this to happen. Now, we can see that for the T cell side of things, this is more inflammatory, but once we start to damage and degrade the myelin, it becomes more degenerative. Now, there is a capacity, once the inflammation has been removed, for a certain level of regeneration to occur. So the oligodendrocytes may recover and remyelinate, and that allows the person to go back into an existing state, so their symptoms might go away. But if it then returns through another spike, then eventually what starts to happen is we get a destruction in the myelin. And this is essentially what we call the sclerosis. And that's the plaquing that we can start to see. Now, when this starts to occur, the speed of action potential is going to be diminished to the point where if there is axonal damage and destruction with complete degradation of the myelin, that propagation potential is completely lost, and that axon or that neuron ceases to function. Now, depending where that is in the body will determine what symptoms start to manifest. So this leads us to the last part of this lecture, which is clinical manifestations. And rather than list all the symptoms that kind of come about, what I thought I would do is put them into syndrome categories, because a lot of them will fit into these areas. So we have a spinal, so these are just syndrome categories. So we have the spinal syndrome, we have brainstem, we have cerebellar, and we have cerebral. And basically all the symptoms that manifest in MS sits within these. So the spinal one is the most common, and the areas that are affected are upper motor neurons. In the sensory side of things, the dorsal column medial meniscus system, and then we have autonomic. So with upper motor neurons, this is affecting, remember going back to the motor system, you have an upper and a lower motor neuron. So when you affect the upper motor neuron, you get certain symptoms like spasticity, hypertonia, so the muscles are all contracted up and very tight. You get slow, weak, stiff movement. So that's more associated with the upper motor neuron. When you look at the dorsal column medial lemniscus, so this is the dorsal column at the back of the spinal cord, these are very heavily myelinated nerves. So if you start to affect those, the patient's likely to start to get pins and needles and numbness, so paresthesias. Whereas autonomic, this can affect bowel and bladder. Particularly bladder seems to be more commonly affected. And what it can do to the bladder is can either make it very lax or very flaccid, and so the bladder becomes atonic, which can be easy overfilled, or it becomes hypertonic or very contracted, and so that leads to the person wanting to always go to the toilet and possibly leading to urge intolerance, or incontinence, should I say. So that's the spinal effects. In terms of the brain stem, it seems to affect a lot of the cranial nerves. Now, not so much the first two cranial nerves, so not so much optic or olfactory in this side of things, but all the other ones. So you might have effects with the coordination of eye movement, so it affects the nerves that move the eye or move the muscles of the eye, and so that could cause a person to have double vision or nystagmus when they move their eye. Also affecting the face, so the muscles of the face, sensation of the face, hearing, so tinnitus, or vestibular, so vertigo. Going to cerebellum, this obviously is going to be affecting coordination, movement, balance, gait, so walking, ataxia, but also speech, so the coordination of muscles for speech, so that could be also affected. And then cerebral, the most common one is the actually optic here, because the optic nerve is technically an extension of the brain, so optic neuritis is common, very common. So this is kind of inflammation and then destruction of the myelin for the optic nerve, and so you're going to likely see things like change in visual acuity, color perception, judging distances, and so forth. So these are all the symptoms that generally will fit within these four areas of syndrome: the spinal, the brainstem, the cerebellar, and the cerebral. I haven't listed them all because they can be very vast and broad, but they generally can be fit quite well into those four categories. So hopefully now we've seen what multiple sclerosis is, we've got an idea of how the risk factors fit into the pathogenesis, and we have an idea now how the pathogenesis manifests to ultimately lead to the destruction of the myelin, because we know it's an inflammatory and a degenerative chronic disease of the central nervous system, and that will result in this array of symptoms.